My name is Aria. I'm in my mid-30s now, and for most of my adult life, I've played roles that don't announce themselves loudly. Strategist, listener, builder of systems that work quietly in the background. I've lived in rooms where confidence is confused with volume, and where the people who speak last are assumed to matter least. That's usually where I am. Not because I lack words, but because I've learned the weight of choosing when to use them. People tend to underestimate me. They see someone agreeable, reliable, calm to the point of being forgettable, someone who doesn't interrupt meetings, who takes notes, who remembers details others discard. I've been called easy to work with, which is often a compliment that hides a deeper assumption, that I won't resist, won't challenge, won't notice. That assumption shaped the beginning of the story. What you're about to hear isn't about revenge. It isn't about exposing villains or delivering a dramatic takedown. There are no raised voices here, no viral confrontations, no moments engineered for applause. This is a story about emotional justice, the quiet kind. The kind that unfolds slowly, internally, long before anyone else realizes a shift has happened. At its surface, this is a workplace story, a modern one. An office with friendly language, casual chats, inside jokes, and the illusion of belonging. A team small enough that you believe trust is automatic. 20 people. That number matters, because one day, without meaning to, I discovered something that changed how I understood every smile, every emoji, every "we're a family here" sentence that had come before. I found a group chat, 19 people, mocking one. The chilling part wasn't the jokes themselves. It was the realization that the people involved weren't strangers, or faceless accounts, or anonymous trolls. They were my office friends, the ones who asked about my weekend, the ones who said my name kindly in meetings, the ones who sat next to me, collaborated with me, and thanked me for my help. Sometimes minutes after typing something cruel behind a screen I was never meant to see. This story is about what happens after that realization. Not the explosive moment, but the quiet aftermath. The way your perception of reality fractures. The way silence takes on a different meaning. The way power rearranges itself when you stop reacting and start observing. Over the next parts, I'll walk you through who I was to them, how small cuts became normalized, and how invisibility can be both a wound and a leverage point. You'll hear about the moment something shifted inside me, not outwardly, not dramatically, but decisively. And you'll see how quiet dominance doesn't announce itself. It simply moves. I'm telling this story honestly, not to dramatize pain and not to encourage retaliation, but to name an experience many people sense yet rarely articulate. The loneliness of being present but unseen, included but excluded, surrounded yet isolated. Before we go any further, let me ask you something gently, without pressure. Have you ever discovered that the place you felt safest was quietly laughing at you when you weren't in the room? To them, I was dependable. That was the word that followed me through the office like a soft shadow. Dependable Aria, calm Aria, the one who would step in when something slipped through the cracks, the one who didn't complain when plans changed late, or when responsibility quietly shifted in my direction without discussion. I was the person people leaned on, and then leaned past. In meetings, I sat slightly back from the table, not because there wasn't room, but because I didn't fight for space. I spoke when there was something worth saying, and when I did, heads nodded, notes were taken. Then the conversation moved on, often without my name attached to the idea anymore. I noticed. I always noticed. I just didn't correct it. They described me as low maintenance. What they meant was, I didn't demand emotional energy. I wasn't the loud one, or the funny one, or the one whose stories dominated lunch breaks. I listened. I remembered birthdays. I filled in gaps. When someone forgot a detail, I had it. When a system broke, I quietly fixed it. When tension rose, I softened my tone so others could stay sharp. That was my role, though no one ever said it out loud. In a team of 20, personalities crystallized quickly. There were the obvious leaders, the social glue, the creative sparks, the ones who challenged authority openly and were praised for it. And then there was me, useful, present, steady, hard to dislike, easy to overlook. If someone had asked my coworkers who I was, they would have said kind things. That's important. No one would have described me as a problem, or a threat, or even particularly memorable. I was safe, predictable, quietly competent. The type of person you assume will always be there, doing what needs to be done, without needing acknowledgement. I became the background hum of the office, necessary but unnoticed unless it is stopped. I didn't resent that at first. Invisibility can feel like peace when you're tired of proving yourself. There's relief in not being scrutinized, in not being pulled into ego battles, in not having to perform confidence for an audience. I told myself I preferred it this way, that this was maturity, professionalism, control. But invisibility has a cost, and it's rarely charged up front. Small things began to define how I existed in that space. My calendar is filled with meetings I was invited to for coverage. My name appeared on tasks that no one wanted, but that everyone trusted me to complete. Credit arrived indirectly, filtered through other voices. Praise when it came was vague. The team really pulled together. This just worked out somehow. I learned where I stood by where I was placed. On email threads, I was CC'd, not addressed. In brainstorming sessions, my ideas were built on by others who received the thanks. When decisions were made, I was informed, not consulted, unless execution was required. Then my opinion suddenly mattered. Still, I stayed pleasant, neutral, observant. Because here's the truth I didn't admit yet. I believed being liked quietly was safer than being seen clearly. I thought visibility invited risk, conflict, misinterpretation. And I had spent years refining the ability to be indispensable without being exposed. What I didn't realize was that to some people, invisibility doesn't register as humility or strength. It registers as permission. Permission to speak around you instead of to you. Permission to define you without your input. Permission to forget that there is a full human being behind the function. Looking back now, I can see the shape of the role I occupied long before anything openly wrong happened. I was the constant, the backdrop, the person no one worried about offending because they assumed I wouldn't notice or wouldn't react. They were wrong about one thing. I noticed everything. I just hadn't decided yet what to do with what I knew. The first small cut didn't arrive loudly. It never does. It came wrapped in humor, disguised as something forgettable. The kind of moment you replay later and wonder why it stayed with you when, technically, nothing bad happened. We were in a team meeting, one of those routine ones where everyone had coffee, cameras on, energy casual. I made a suggestion about streamlining a process that had been slowing us down for weeks. I'd tested it quietly on my own time. It worked. I explained it calmly, without urgency, the way I always did. There was a pause. Not disagreement, just emptiness. Then someone else spoke. A louder voice, a more confident delivery. They repeated the idea, not word for word, but close enough that my stomach tightened. This time, people reacted. Laughter, interest, a few nods. Someone said, "Oh, that's smart." I waited, not tensely, just long enough to see if my name would come up. It didn't. The meeting moved on. Afterward, one colleague messaged me privately. "Good idea back there," they wrote. A smile emoji followed, as if that settled something. I remember staring at the screen longer than necessary. It wasn't anger I felt. It was confusion. A subtle disorientation. Like stepping down one stair too many in the dark. You don't fall, but your body registers the miscalculation. I told myself it was nothing, that these things happen, that credit is fluid in group environments, that I didn't need recognition to know my value. All of that was true, and also incomplete. The cut deepened a week later in a different shape. We were chatting informally before work began. Jokes were flying. Someone teased someone else. Then the attention shifted toward me, not directly, not cruelly, just pointedly. "Oh, careful," someone laughed. "Aria will write that down in her little notebook." People chuckled. It was said lightly, almost affectionately, but something about the phrasing landed wrong, the little part. The way my habits, my attentiveness, my quietness, were framed as quirks rather than strengths. I smiled. Of course I did, because smiling is what keeps moments small. No one noticed anything off. The conversation flowed on. If I'd said something, if I'd asked what they meant, it would have disrupted the tone, made it awkward, oversensitive maybe, so I let it pass. But I didn't forget it. That's the thing about small cuts. They don't bleed enough to alarm anyone else. They're easy to dismiss, easy to explain away. Humor, timing, misinterpretation. You start doing the other person's work for them, softening the meaning so you don't have to feel the sting. I became very good at that. Another time, I walked into the break room mid-laughter. A conversation stopped too abruptly. Someone said my name, surprised. Someone else said, nothing, too quickly. I told myself I was projecting. That's not everything is about you. That sometimes a pause is just a pause. Still, my body remembered. There's a quiet intelligence in discomfort. It doesn't shout, it taps. Tap, tap, tap. Each instance alone was insignificant. Together, they formed a pattern I wasn't ready to name yet. A sense that I existed as an idea in the room, not fully as a person. A character others could comment on, lightly mock, or reinterpret, because I wasn't expected to push back. And the strangest part, no one else seemed to notice anything wrong, which made me wonder if I was imagining it. That's where self-doubt enters, not as a dramatic collapse, but as a subtle erosion. You start asking yourself whether your sensitivity is the problem, whether being observant has made you fragile, whether silence is safer than clarity. So I stayed quiet. I kept showing up the same way, doing the work, supporting the team, writing in my notebook, smiling when jokes brushed too close to something personal. But somewhere inside me, a file had opened. Not labeled anger, not labeled as revenge, just awareness. And once awareness exists, even the smallest cut leaves a mark. Once something happens more than once, it stops feeling like an accident. It becomes a pattern. At first, I didn't call it disrespect. That word felt too heavy, too dramatic for what was happening. Instead, I gave it gentler names: misalignment, misunderstanding, personality differences. I told myself that every workplace has its rhythms, and that maybe this was simply how ours worked. So when the small dismissals repeated, I absorbed them quietly. Meetings developed a familiar cadence. I'd contribute early, setting a foundation. Others would build on it, often receiving the recognition. Sometimes my idea came back to me days later in a polished email from someone else, framed as if it had appeared fully formed in their mind. When that happened, I felt a brief, sharp awareness, and then I let it go. Letting things go became a skill. There was a way decisions were discussed around me rather than with me. The way inside jokes formed in channels I wasn't part of, then spilled into shared spaces where I smiled along without context. The way my input was treated as logistical rather than strategic, even when it shaped outcomes. No one was overtly cruel. That made it harder. Cruelty is easy to name. Subtlety demands interpretation. I started noticing how often I was framed as support. Not a leader, not a driver, support. The reliable force behind the scenes. When deadlines were tight, I was asked to help. When things went well, the story skipped over how they got there. And still, I stayed. I stayed because I was good at rationalizing, because I understood nuance, because I didn't want to be the person who made things weird. There's a quiet pressure in workplaces that doesn't explicitly harm you, but also doesn't protect you. The pressure to endure, to adapt, to be emotionally flexible in ways that benefit everyone except yourself. I told myself I was being mature. I told myself that speaking up would label me difficult, that calling out small things would overshadow my real contributions, that my silence was strategic, that patience would be rewarded, that consistency would eventually lead to respect. Those stories sounded reasonable. They kept me functional, but something else was happening beneath them. Each time I chose silence, I felt myself shrink just a little, not in confidence, but in presence. I became more careful with my words, more measured, less spontaneous. I edited myself preemptively, smoothing edges no one had explicitly asked me to smooth. I watched how others navigated the same space, how some people could interrupt without consequence, how certain tones were interpreted as passion instead of aggression, how mistakes were forgiven quickly when made by the right person. I learned the unspoken hierarchy not through titles, but through reactions. Who could be sharp and still be liked? Who could be vague and still be trusted? Who could take up space without explanation? And who couldn't? I told myself I didn't need that kind of power, that I valued stability over influence, that I preferred depth to visibility. These things were partly true, but they also served as armor against disappointment, because admitting I wanted more would mean admitting I wasn't getting it. There were moments when I almost spoke up. A meeting where my contribution was overlooked too cleanly, a joke that leaned a little too far into who I was assumed to be, a decision that affected my work deeply, but was made without my input. Each time I paused, and in that pause, I imagined the possible outcomes, the awkwardness, the defensiveness, the subtle shift in how I might be seen. I weighed that against the certainty of staying quiet and being tolerated. Tolerated felt safer, so I normalized what shouldn't have been normal. I learned to preempt disappointment by expecting less. I adjusted my internal bar for recognition. I focused on execution, not acknowledgement. I became the person who made things work, not the one who was seen making them work. And here's the uncomfortable truth I can admit now. By staying silent, I helped maintain the version of me they were comfortable with, the agreeable one, The background one. The one who wouldn't disrupt the story they were telling about the team. That realization didn't come all at once. It arrived slowly, through fatigue. Through a quiet sense of misalignment between how much I gave and how little I was allowed to exist as a full voice. Still, I didn't confront anyone, not yet, because at this stage, I still believed the problem could be solved by enduring it better, by being even more reasonable, even more composed, even more invisible. I thought if I just stayed long enough, stayed kind enough, stayed useful enough, something would eventually shift in my favor. I didn't know then that something was shifting, just not in the way I expected. Roles don't always come with announcements. Sometimes they settle around you quietly, shaped by repetition and reinforced by what you don't challenge. By the time you notice them, they already feel permanent. I began to understand my role the day I realized people didn't ask what I wanted. They assumed what I would accept. It showed up in small, practical ways. Extra work landed in my lap without discussion, framed as a given. "You're so good at this," they'd say, as if competence were consent. When something urgent appeared late on a Friday, eyes drifted toward me automatically, not because I volunteered, but because I always delivered. I was the stabilizer, the buffer, the one who absorbed friction so others could stay comfortable. When tensions rose between stronger personalities, I was positioned in the middle, asked to smooth things over, translate, rephrase, compromise. My calmness became a tool others used, not a quality they respected. And I let it happen, because pushing back would have required me to disrupt the version of me everyone relied on. The more I observed, the clearer the pattern became. My value wasn't tied to my ideas or perspective. It was tied to my availability, to how easily I could be leaned on, how rarely I said no. I wasn't invited into decision-making spaces to shape direction, only to ensure execution went smoothly afterward. It was subtle but consistent. When plans were discussed informally, I found out after they'd already solidified. When credit was distributed, my name appeared in the middle of a list, never highlighted. When praise was given, it focused on my work ethic, not my thinking. Hardworking, reliable, supportive. Words that sound positive until you realize what's missing. No one asked if I wanted more visibility, or leadership, or influence. They assumed I didn't, or worse, that I wasn't suited for it. That assumption did not come from malice, it came from comfort. I fit the role too well. I had trained people how to treat me by what I tolerated. And once a role is established, people defend it. Not consciously, but instinctively. When someone exists to make things easier, asking them to take up more space feels like a disruption. I noticed it the first time I gently pushed back. I declined a last-minute task, explaining I already had capacity constraints. The reaction was immediate but quiet. A pause, a shift in tone, not anger, surprise. As if a piece of furniture had moved unexpectedly. "Oh," someone said carefully. "Okay, we'll figure something out." We did. The task was reassigned, the world didn't end. But something changed. I felt it in the air afterward. A slight coolness, less warmth, less casual friendliness. As if my usefulness had briefly come into question. That's when it clicked. My acceptance wasn't unconditional, it was transactional. As long as I stayed in my role, helpful, quiet, adaptable, I was appreciated. The moment I stepped outside it, even politely, the dynamic wobbled. Not enough to be called a conflict, just enough to be felt. I started seeing the invisible boundaries more clearly. Where could I speak? Where I shouldn't? What kind of ambition would be seen as natural for others, but suspicious coming from me? And with that clarity came something else, a choice. I could continue playing the role as assigned, stay safe within it, or I could acknowledge what it cost me, emotionally, professionally, internally. At the time, I didn't act on that choice yet, but naming the role was the beginning of something irreversible. Because once you understand how you're being used, you can no longer pretend it's accidental. You can still be kind. You can still be calm, but you are no longer naive. And that awareness, quiet, steady, unannounced, is where power begins to shift. The day something shifted didn't look important from the outside. There was no argument, no email, no meeting where tensions boiled over. If you'd been watching from across the room, you wouldn't have noticed anything different at all. I was still calm, still polite, still doing my work. But internally, something settled into place, with a finality I hadn't felt before. It started late in the afternoon. On a day that had already asked too much of me, my calendar was stacked. Messages piled up faster than I could answer them. I'd just finished fixing a problem I hadn't created, one that would be invisible once resolved, as most of my work was. I opened my laptop to send a file to a teammate. That's when I saw it. A notification banner, partially hidden behind another window. A preview of a message thread I didn't recognize at first. A name that looked familiar, but not quite right. Curiosity made me pause. Fatigue made me careless. I clicked. It wasn't meant for me. I knew that immediately. A group chat, casual, active, filled with reactions and inside language. And as I scrolled, my name appeared. Not tagged, not addressed, just referenced. Like an object in a room, not a person in the conversation. 19 people. 19. In a team of 20. They weren't raging. They weren't overtly vicious. That almost made it worse. The tone was light, playful, comfortable. Comments about my habits, my quietness, my seriousness. A joke about how I probably wouldn't notice anyway. A laughing emoji, then another. I felt something cold pass through me. Not shock, exactly. More like confirmation. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a single insensitive person. This was a shared space I had never been invited into, where my absence was part of the entertainment. The realization landed slowly but decisively. I had been cyberbullied by my own office friends. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. I didn't feel the rush of adrenaline people describe in moments of betrayal. What I felt was stillness, a strange, heavy calm, like the moment after a door closes and you realize it locked behind you. I scrolled carefully, not obsessively, just enough to understand the shape of it. They joked about my notebook, about my tone, about how serious I was, about how I was always there but never really there. Someone wrote, "At least she gets things done," as if that balanced it. I closed the chat. I sat back in my chair and looked around the office. The same desks, the same people typing. Someone laughed a few rows away. Someone waved at me. I waved back automatically. And that was the moment, not when I found the chat, but when I realized how easily I could still perform normalcy. That's when I understood something fundamental had changed. Before, I had been quiet because I was patient. Now, I was quiet because I was awake. I didn't confront anyone, not because I was afraid, but because confrontation suddenly felt unnecessary, small, insufficient. Nothing they could say would undo what I'd seen, and nothing I could say in that moment would shift the power dynamic meaningfully. Emotional reactions would only serve the story they already had of me. Overly sensitive, too serious, unable to take a joke. I wasn't interested in confirming that narrative. Instead, I asked myself a single, clarifying question. What does this knowledge make possible? The answer didn't arrive fully formed, but the direction did. I stopped assuming goodwill where there was none. I stopped confusing politeness with loyalty. I stopped offering access to my inner world. I didn't become cold, I became precise. That day I finished my work. I sent the file. I smiled when spoken to. I even laughed once, at the right moment. But internally, I began separating appearance from reality. The room hadn't changed. The people hadn't changed. I had. And once that shift happens, quietly, internally, there is no going back to who you were before you knew. After that day, my silence changed texture. Before, it had been reflexive. A habit formed by patience, by conflict avoidance, by the belief that time and consistency would naturally correct misunderstandings. Now, silence was deliberate, measured, chosen. From the outside, nothing looked different. That was the point. I still showed up on time. I still delivered what I was responsible for. I still spoke when necessary and stayed quiet when it served the room. If anything, I became easier to work with, more contained, less reactive, the kind of presence people don't question. And because of that, no one noticed the shift. They interpreted my quiet as acceptance, as a resignation, as proof that whatever they'd been saying about me, in that group chat I was never meant to see, had been accurate. That I was harmless, that I wouldn't challenge anything that truly mattered. That misinterpretation gave me room. I stopped volunteering information, not in a dramatic way, just small adjustments. I answered questions fully but no longer offered additional context unless asked. I documented everything, conversations, decisions, timelines, not out of paranoia, but out of clarity. When something was decided without my input, I noted it. When credit moved away from its source, I observed how and by whom. When tone shifted in subtle ways, I paid attention to who initiated it and who followed. Silence gave me data. I also began setting boundaries that were invisible to others, but firm to me. I declined work that wasn't mine, politely, consistently. I stopped rescuing projects at the last minute unless it was part of my defined role. I didn't announce these changes. I simply enacted them. Some people noticed the effects before they noticed the cause. Tasks took longer to resolve. Gaps appeared where I used to fill them instinctively. Questions were asked that I would have preempted before. A few colleagues looked confused, then mildly frustrated. No one said anything to me directly. That told me everything. They weren't upset that I was overwhelmed. They were unsettled that I was no longer compensating. In meetings, I spoke less, but when I did, I was specific. I stopped softening my language to protect egos. I stated facts. I asked clarifying questions. I let silence sit when no one answered instead of rushing to save the moment. Silence, I learned, makes people reveal themselves. Some filled it with nervous jokes. Some rushed to reassert control. Some looked to me, expecting me to smooth things over. I didn't, and still, no one confronted me. Because from their perspective, I was still nice. Still professional, still doing my job. The discomfort they felt didn't have a clear source. That's what made my silence powerful. It couldn't be accused. They mistook it for weakness, for passivity, for the same old pattern continuing. Meanwhile, I was watching how information moved, how alliances are formed, how decisions were justified after the fact. I noticed which people were central to communication loops, and which ones benefited from staying just vague enough to avoid accountability. I noticed how often humor was used as cover, how jokes softened cruelty, how sarcasm disguises hierarchy. And most importantly, I noticed how little awareness there was of my internal world. They still thought I didn't see, didn't understand, didn't remember. That assumption was their greatest gift to me, because when people underestimate your awareness, they stop editing themselves. They reveal patterns they think are invisible. They leave trails. I wasn't collecting evidence to expose anyone. I wasn't plotting revenge. That kind of thinking would have narrowed my options too early. What I was doing was positioning, understanding where I stood, understanding where the leverage points were, understanding what would happen if I stopped being what they expected. Silence in that phase wasn't about disappearing. It was about becoming unreadable, and unreadable people are often far more powerful than loud ones, because no one knows when or how they might move. What they never noticed was how much I was learning while they assumed I was simply complying. There's a particular kind of invisibility that grants access. When people believe you're non-threatening, they stop guarding their words. They think out loud around you. They forward messages without rereading them. They CC you on things they shouldn't, assuming you'll process, fix, and forget. I stopped forgetting. I began keeping records, not secretive, not dramatic, just thorough. Meeting summaries saved with timestamps. Decision rationales are archived alongside outcomes. Versions of documents are tracked carefully, not because I plan to use them against anyone, but because clarity is a form of self-respect. I learned who actually made decisions versus who had authority, who shaped narratives after the fact, who benefited most from ambiguity. I noticed patterns in how accountability was deflected, always sideways, never upward. And I noticed something else, how much of the team's stability quietly rested on work I did that no one explicitly acknowledged. Processes I designed were still running. Systems I'd patched were still holding. Institutional memory lived largely in my head and in my notes. I knew why things worked, not just that they did. That knowledge was leverage, even if I hadn't named it yet. I also started learning outside the office, quietly, strategically. I refreshed skills I'd let stagnate because I was busy being useful. I studied organizational dynamics, contracts, and labor practices. I talked to mentors, not about drama, but about options, hypotheticals, pathways. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing, because when people think you're staying put, they behave differently around you. I positioned myself carefully. I took on visible projects that aligned with my role, but I made sure outcomes were traceable. I clarified ownership in writing. I asked follow-up questions that forced specificity, not accusations, just structure. Some people adjusted, some didn't notice, some grew slightly uneasy without knowing why. I watched how quickly discomfort surfaced when expectations shifted. When I asked for clarity instead of absorbing confusion. When I didn't immediately fix what I hadn't broken. When I let small failures remain visible long enough to be recognized as systemic, not personal. No one connected these changes to me. They assumed inefficiencies were temporary, that I'd step in eventually, that I always did. That assumption gave me time. I also learned who wasn't part of the group chat, who spoke to me with consistency, who didn't participate in the subtle dismissals. Those distinctions mattered. They helped me separate individuals from the culture that enabled the behavior. This wasn't about painting everyone as the same. It was about accuracy. And accuracy changes how you move. I stopped internalizing their behavior as commentary on my worth. I saw it for what it was, a dynamic that benefited certain people and cost others quietly. Once I removed myself emotionally from that equation, my thinking sharpened. I wasn't angry. I wasn't hurt in the way people expect. I was focused. I understood the system better than most people in it. Not because I was smarter, but because I had been underestimated long enough to observe without interference. They never noticed how often their jokes revealed insecurity, how their mockery relied on my silence, how dependent they were on the stability that they didn't see me maintaining. They didn't notice when I stopped cushioning their mistakes. They didn't notice when I stopped translating for them. They didn't notice when I started preparing for a future that didn't include compensating for their comfort. And that's the thing about quiet preparation. It doesn't announce itself. It looks like nothing until it's finished. By the time anyone sensed a change coming, I was already positioned. Calm, documented, clear. I hadn't exposed anyone. I hadn't confronted anyone. I hadn't raised my voice once. But I was no longer standing where they thought I was. And that difference, between where you assume someone is and where they actually are, is where irreversible shifts begin. The reveal didn't come with satisfaction. There was no rush of triumph. No moment where I leaned back and thought, so this is where the power is. What I felt instead was a quiet gravity, as if something heavy had finally settled into place. I realized my leverage by accident. I was reviewing documentation late one evening, not hunting for anything specific, just organizing the way I always did when I needed my thoughts to slow down. Threads, files, timelines, patterns laid out cleanly tend to speak for themselves. That's when I saw it. Not a single dramatic error, not misconduct in the obvious sense, but a structural dependency so complete that it startled me. So much of the team's operational continuity flowed through me, through decisions I'd made, systems I'd built, and context only I fully held. Not because I hoarded information, but because I'd been the one consistently asked to just handle it. Over time, that accumulation became invisible to everyone else, including them. I traced it carefully. If I stepped back, not emotionally, not dramatically, just practically, things wouldn't collapse immediately. They'd wobble first. Deadlines would stretch. Questions would circulate without answers. Decisions would stall while people searched for context they assumed lived somewhere shared. It didn't. It lived with me. And then there was something else. In my documentation, emails, approvals, message threads, I saw how often responsibility had been redirected without clarity, how decisions were implied rather than stated, how accountability blurred in ways that protected some people and exposed others. Not illegal, not explosive, just fragile, the kind of fragility that holds only as long as everyone stays quiet and cooperative. I sat with that knowledge longer than I expected to, because leverage isn't something you celebrate when you have a moral compass. It forces you to ask hard questions about who you want to be when the balance shifts in your favor. I didn't want to punish anyone. I didn't want to humiliate anyone. I didn't want to win. What I wanted was alignment between how I was treated and how much I carried. And for the first time, I understood I didn't need their permission to correct that imbalance. The most unsettling part was how calm I felt. No anger surged up. No fantasies of exposure, just a steady understanding. I am not as powerless here as they believe. And neither were they as secure. I also realized something important, something that grounded me. Leverage only matters if you don't rush it. If I acted emotionally, I would collapse all my options into one. If I confronted anyone now, I'd be dismissed, minimized, or reframed as dramatic. The group chat would become a joke about Aria finally snapping. That story would serve them, so I didn't act. Instead, I refined my clarity. I asked myself what outcomes I could live with, what lines I would not cross, what kind of resolution would let me walk away without carrying bitterness forward. I made a quiet promise to myself. Whatever I do next will be clean. No threats, no public shaming, no chaos. Just consequences that followed naturally from choices already made. That's when I understood the true shape of the leverage I held. It wasn't the documentation, it wasn't the systems, it wasn't even the dependency. It was timing. I could choose when to step back, how to shift, what to reveal, and what to keep private. And most importantly, I could choose to stop protecting people from the effects of their own behavior. That realization didn't feel empowering in a loud way. It felt clarifying, like standing on solid ground after adjusting to uneven terrain for too long. I closed my laptop that night and slept deeply for the first time in weeks. Not because the situation was resolved, but because I finally knew where I stood. And when you know that, truly, there's no urgency anymore, only intention. Knowing you have options is one thing. Choosing one, especially the one that can't be undone, is something else entirely. After the private reveal, I gave myself time, not out of fear, but out of respect for the weight of the moment. Decisions made too quickly tend to serve emotion. I wanted mine to serve alignment. I laid the options out clearly, the way I do with any complex problem. The first option was confrontation. Direct, honest, emotionally clean. I could request a meeting, present what I'd seen, name the group chat, ask for accountability. In theory, that path led to apologies, awkwardness, maybe policy discussions. But I knew how stories are rewritten in rooms like ours. Confrontation would center my feelings, not the system. It would invite defensiveness, minimization, and subtle character reframing. The narrative would become about whether I was hurt or overreacting, not about why the behavior existed in the first place. I would be visible, but in the wrong way. The second option was exposure, screenshots, escalation, making the behavior undeniable. That option carried power, but also collateral damage. It would force a reckoning, yes, but one fueled by shock and fear. It would harden people, push them into camps, and bind me to the story forever. I didn't want to be known as the person who blew things up, not because they didn't deserve consequences, but because I didn't want to live inside the aftermath. The third option was endurance, staying quiet, accepting the role, letting the group chat remain a secret wound I carried alone. That option was no longer viable. Once you see something clearly, you cannot unsee it. Endurance at that point becomes self-betrayal. The fourth option, the one that scared me most because it was so calm, was withdrawal, not a dramatic resignation, not a sudden disappearance, but a deliberate, structured removal of myself from the position that made their behavior comfortable. I could stop being the silent stabilizer, stop absorbing risk, stop holding systems together without acknowledgement. I could make my presence conditional instead of assumed. That option didn't punish anyone directly. It simply changed the environment. And environments reveal truth faster than arguments ever do. I sat with that choice for days, because once you step back intentionally, there is no returning to innocence. People may try to restore the old dynamic, but it will never be the same. You will always be the person who could leave again. That's what made it irreversible. I asked myself the hardest question I know. Am I willing to be misunderstood in order to be free? Because choosing withdrawal meant I wouldn't get the satisfaction of immediate acknowledgement. People might never fully understand why things changed. Some would assume I'd lost motivation. Others would quietly resent me for no longer making their lives easier. But my integrity would remain intact. And so I chose the irreversible option. I didn't announce it. I didn't explain it. I didn't seek validation. I simply began the process. I clarified my scope in writing. I redistributed knowledge that shouldn't live in one place, but only what was appropriate to share. I documented transitions carefully. I stopped filling gaps that weren't mine. And internally, I detached. Not emotionally, professionally. I stopped measuring my worth by how needed I was. I stopped confusing usefulness with belonging. I stopped waiting for an apology that would never arrive in a form that mattered. That decision didn't feel brave in the moment. It felt quiet, almost boring. But it changed everything, because when you remove yourself cleanly from a dynamic that relied on your silence, the system has no choice but to respond. And from that point on, there was no path back to who I used to be in that room, only forward into whatever the truth revealed next. Once the decision was made, everything slowed down, in a good way. There's a particular calm that comes when you're no longer debating with yourself. No emotional back and forth, no second guessing, just a sequence of steps that need to be taken, quietly, correctly. I began moving in silence, not secrecy. There's a difference. Silence is about not narrating your process, about letting actions exist without commentary. I didn't owe anyone visibility into my internal recalibration. The first things I addressed were structural. I reviewed my contract carefully, line by line, not looking for loopholes, just clarity, scope, responsibilities. Notice periods, language that defined expectations, and just as importantly, what wasn't required of me. That alone was grounding. So much of what I'd been doing lived outside what I was actually obligated to do. I hadn't realized how far I'd stretched myself to maintain a sense of belonging. Seeing it in black and white recentered me. I also spoke to a professional, quietly, confidentially, not to file complaints, not to escalate, but to understand my options, to make sure that whatever steps I took were clean, defensible, and aligned with policy. Information is stabilizing when you're not using it as a weapon. I adjusted my workflow next. I reduced overlap. I clarified handoffs. I stopped acting as the default bridge between teams. When questions came in, I answered them, but I didn't chase them. If clarity was missing, I named it and waited. People adapt when forced to. At first, they didn't notice. Why would they? From their perspective, I was still there, still calm, still competent, still saying yes to what was clearly mine. The difference was invisible unless you were looking closely. I also stopped sharing context preemptively, not out of spite, but because context is a form of labor, and I had been giving it freely for years without realizing how much it cost me. Now I shared it intentionally. I created documentation not just for continuity, but for transfer. Clean, clear, neutral. I didn't frame it as an exit. I framed it as sustainability. Ironically, that language was praised. "This is really helpful," someone said in a meeting. "We should have had this earlier." I nodded, no commentary. I made sure my work was traceable, my contributions visible in the right ways. Not performative, just documented. Ownership clarified, decisions logged. Still, no one sensed the shift. Because silence looks like stability until the moment it doesn't. Outside of work, I prepared as well. I updated my portfolio quietly, reconnected with contacts I trusted, explored possibilities without attachment. I didn't announce dissatisfaction. I didn't vent. I didn't need validation. I needed optionality. That's the part people often miss. Moving in silence isn't about plotting. It's about widening your future so you're not trapped by a single outcome. Inside the office, the group chat continued. Unseen, unheard, irrelevant. Whatever they said no longer shaped my self-perception or my strategy. They still believed I was the same. That belief gave me time. Time to align my actions with my values. Time to ensure that when consequences came, they would arrive without theatrics. Time to make sure I could walk away with my head clear and my hands clean. When you stop explaining yourself, you reclaim an extraordinary amount of energy. I used that energy to build an exit that didn't look like one. And by the time anyone realized something was different, the conditions had already changed. The consequences didn't arrive with drama. They arrived in confusion. At first, it was subtle. Questions that used to be answered quickly began circulating longer than usual. Messages went unread for a few hours instead of a few minutes. Tasks that once moved smoothly started catching on invisible edges. No one blamed me. Not yet. They blamed timing, workload, bad luck. I watched it happen with a strange sense of distance. Not detachment, but clarity. This wasn't something I was doing to them. It was something that happened when a system lost an unacknowledged support. Meetings became less efficient. Conversations looped. Decisions stalled because no one felt confident enough to finalize them without just one more check. I could see people searching for the certainty I used to provide automatically. Sometimes they looked to me. I met their eyes. I answered when asked. I did not fill the silence beyond that. That was new. I could feel the shift in how people experienced my absence, not physically, but functionally. The ease they'd grown used to was gone, and they couldn't quite name why. A few colleagues started reaching out more directly, not to ask how I was, but to ask where things stood. What was the status? If I could take a quick look. I did, within scope, on my timeline. The discomfort deepened. One afternoon, I overheard someone say, "I feel like things are slipping lately." Another replied, "Yeah, I don't know what changed." I knew, and still I said nothing, because the truth didn't require my explanation. It required their observation. What struck me most was how quickly the narrative shifted. The same people who once joked about my quietness now seemed unsettled by it. The absence of my constant stabilizing presence created a vacuum, and vacuums demand attention. But instead of turning inward, some people began looking for a cause. Processes were questioned, tools blamed, external pressures cited. Anything but the possibility that the dynamic itself had relied on someone they hadn't fully respected. It was never about missing me. It was about missing what I provided. That distinction mattered. One colleague, someone I'd always thought of as neutral, pulled me aside. "You seem different lately," they said carefully, not accusing, just curious. I smiled. "Different how?" They hesitated. "I don't know, quieter maybe, more contained." Contained. I thanked them for checking in. I didn't elaborate. Because containment was exactly the point. As weeks passed, the strain became harder to ignore. Deadlines slipped. Minor errors compounded. People grew tense. Friction surfaced in places where I used to smooth it away before it became visible. And still, no one confronted me directly. That silence told me they sensed the shift but didn't feel entitled to question it. Power dynamics often reveal themselves not in conflict, but in hesitation. I also noticed something else, something quieter, but just as telling. The tone toward me began to change. Less teasing, more caution, a kind of watchfulness. As if people were recalibrating how they interacted with me, unsure which version they were dealing with now. That uncertainty worked in my favor. I hadn't accused anyone. I hadn't withdrawn emotionally. I hadn't broken any rules. And yet, the comfort they once had around me was gone. They were experiencing the consequences of a dynamic they'd helped create, without a clear villain to blame. That's the thing about quiet consequences. They don't announce themselves as punishment. They simply make patterns visible. And once visible, those patterns can't be unseen. I stayed steady through it all, professional, kind, unreactive. Inside, I felt something settle, not satisfied, not vindication, just confirmation. The system was responding exactly as it should when an unrecognized pillar stepped aside. By the time people realized something was wrong, they were already behind it. The confusion that had once felt abstract began to sharpen into concern. Meetings multiplied, check-ins were scheduled, phrases like alignment, reset, and communication gaps started appearing in calendars. Still, no one named the real issue, because naming it would require admitting that the stability they missed had always been a person, and that they hadn't treated her like one. I could feel the shift in how people approached me. The casual confidence they once had was gone, replaced by a careful politeness. Questions were framed more thoughtfully, requests softened. Not because they suddenly respected me more, but because they needed me. And that was when I knew it was too late. The irony was quiet but unmistakable. When I was giving freely, my presence was taken for granted. When I pulled back, my value became visible, but only as a resource, not as a person. A few people tried to repair things in small ways. Compliments appeared where none had before. Invitations to meetings I'd previously been excluded from were suddenly extended. My opinions were solicited more directly. The timing said everything. These gestures weren't wrong. They were just reactive. And once change is motivated by loss rather than understanding, it rarely restores trust. I accepted the invitations. I answered the questions. I remained calm and cooperative. But internally, I was already somewhere else. There was a moment, small, almost unnoticeable, when I realized the window had closed. A senior colleague asked me gently if I felt supported. The question hung between us, well-intentioned but vague. I paused, just long enough to choose my words. "I feel clear," I said. They nodded, unsure what to do with that. Clarity is uncomfortable when people are hoping for reassurance. Behind the scenes, I sensed panic beginning to ripple. Not loud, not dramatic, but urgent. Processes were reevaluated. Responsibilities were reassigned hastily. People tried to recreate systems without fully understanding how they worked. I watched it all with a kind of sad distance, not because I wanted them to struggle, but because struggle was now the only teacher left. Some people likely revisited past interactions in their minds, wondered if they'd missed something, if a joke had gone too far, if silence had meant something else. But regret that arrives late tends to circle around self-preservation, not accountability. No one asked me directly about the group chat. That silence spoke volumes. Either they assumed I didn't know, or they hoped I wouldn't bring it up. Both assumptions rested on the same foundation, underestimating me. By then, my path was already in motion, quietly, cleanly, without spectacle. There's a strange calm that comes when you know a chapter has ended, even if the people around you are still trying to revise it. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt resolved. They were scrambling to fix symptoms. I had already addressed the cause. And causes, once addressed internally, don't reopen easily. One colleague, someone who had once laughed easily in my presence, said to me one afternoon, "I hope you know you're really appreciated." It was sincere, and it was late. I thanked them. I meant it. But appreciation offered in response to absence can't replace respect that was never given. By the time the team understood that the version of me they relied on was no longer available, the conditions that created her were gone, and nothing they did after that could bring her back. The confrontation, when it finally happened, was almost anticlimactic. No raised voices, no accusations, no rehearsed speeches, just a closed door, 2 chairs, and a tone so careful it bordered on fragile. I was asked to meet with 2 senior colleagues. The phrasing was neutral, a check-in, a conversation. By then, I understood what that meant. They weren't there to discipline me. They were there because something felt wrong, and they didn't know how to name it. I walked into the room calmly, sat down, waited. They spoke first, about workflow challenges, about shifting dynamics, about how things felt different lately. The language was abstract, almost evasive, as if clarity itself might cause damage. I listened. Then one of them finally said it. "You've seemed distant." I nodded, not in agreement, just acknowledgement. They asked if something had happened, if there was feedback I hadn't shared, if there was a way to reset. That word again. I took a breath, not because I was nervous, but because precision matters when moments are quiet. "I'm not distant," I said evenly. "I'm just no longer compensating." The room went still. I didn't elaborate right away. Silence does important work when you let it. They asked what I meant. "I've been operating beyond my role for a long time," I said. I didn't object to it then, but I'm not willing to continue doing that now. No blame, no emotion, just a statement of fact. They shifted in their chairs. One asked if I felt undervalued. The other asked if I felt excluded. I considered the questions carefully. "I feel clear about what I'm responsible for," I said, "and what I'm not." It wasn't the answer they expected. There was a pause, then a gentle attempt to open the door further, to invite more, to encourage vulnerability. I chose not to walk through it, not because I didn't feel anything, but because this conversation wasn't about healing. It was about containment, about stabilizing a system that had begun to wobble. Eventually, one of them asked if there had been something specific that triggered the change. This was the moment I'd anticipated for weeks. I could name the group chat. I could recount the jokes. I could make the room heavy with the truth they'd avoided. Instead, I said, "I noticed patterns that made it clear I needed to change how I show up." That was all. They didn't press. I could see it in their faces, the calculation, the awareness that there was more beneath the surface, paired with the understanding that pushing might reveal something they weren't ready to manage. And that was enough. The conversation shifted toward logistics, scope, expectations, next steps. Professional language resumed its place like a shield. Before we stood to leave, one of them said carefully, "We value you. We hope you know that." I met their eyes. "I know what I provide," I said, "and I'm comfortable with how that's defined now." No anger, no bitterness, no heat. That was the confrontation. Walking out of the room, I felt lighter, not because I'd been understood, but because I hadn't compromised myself to be understood. Sometimes, the most powerful confrontation is the one that refuses to inflict pain. I returned to my desk, finished my work, closed my laptop at the end of the day. Nothing dramatic happened afterward, and that was the point. I am not who I was in that room anymore. Not because something was taken from me, but because something clarified. For a long time, I believed my value lived in how much I could carry without being seen. I mistook endurance for strength and silence for grace. I thought being indispensable meant being safe. Now I understand the difference. Who I am now is quieter in a different way. Not smaller, just more deliberate. I no longer confuse calm with compliance, or kindness with availability. I still listen deeply, I still work with care, but I no longer disappear inside systems that benefit from my erasure. My identity is no longer shaped by how useful I am to people who don't fully see me. That shift didn't turn me bitter. If anything, it softened me toward myself. I stopped replaying old moments, asking whether I should have spoken sooner, pushed harder, reacted differently. Those questions belong to an earlier version of me, one who believed clarity could only come from external validation. Now clarity is internal. I know what I contribute. I know what I will not tolerate. I know the cost of silence and the cost of speech, and I choose accordingly. What surprised me most was how little resentment I carried forward. I had expected anger to linger, or disappointment to calcify into cynicism. But once I released the need to be understood by people who had already decided who I was, the emotional weight dissolved. I didn't need them to admit what they'd done. I didn't need apologies that would have come too late. I didn't need closure delivered in words. I created closure through alignment, through acting in a way that matched my values, even when it would have been easier to stay comfortable. I also became more precise in how I let people into my life. At work and beyond, I pay attention now, not just to how people speak to me, but to how they speak about others, to how they treat quiet competence, to determine whether humor is used to connect or to deflect responsibility. I trust patterns more than promises. That doesn't make me guarded, it makes me grounded. If there's one thing this experience gave me, it's a deep respect for quiet strength. Not the kind that endures everything, but the kind that knows when to step away. The kind that doesn't announce boundaries, but enforces them consistently. I didn't win anything visible. I didn't lose anything essential. What I gained was authorship over my own presence, and that has changed how I move through every room since. I no longer wait to be assigned a role. I choose how I participate, or whether I do it all. That choice is freedom. There's a version of this story that could have ended loudly, with screenshots, with arguments, with a public reckoning that forced everyone to look at what they'd done. But that was never the ending I wanted. What I learned through this experience is something quieter and far more lasting. When people mistreat you in subtle ways, they often rely on your silence to protect their comfort. They assume your calm means consent. Your professionalism means you won't disrupt the system, even if the system is quietly harming you. The truth is, you don't owe anyone your endurance. You don't owe explanations to people who benefit from misunderstanding you. You don't owe access to your inner world to those who only engage with you when it serves them. And you certainly don't owe loyalty to environments that mistake your quietness for weakness. Emotional justice doesn't always look like exposure. Sometimes it looks like withdrawal. It looks like stepping back without accusation, like letting systems feel the weight they placed on you without acknowledgement, like choosing not to rescue people from the consequences of their own assumptions. That kind of justice doesn't humiliate anyone. It doesn't escalate conflict. It doesn't require you to become someone you're not. It simply restores balance. If you're listening to this and recognizing yourself in pieces of my story, the one who carries more than they're credited for, the one who stays silent to keep the peace, the one who is liked but not fully respected, I want you to know this. Your awareness is not a flaw, your restraint is not invisibility, and your power doesn't require permission to exist. You don't have to explain your departure from dynamics that no longer honor you. You don't have to prove you were hurt badly enough to justify protecting yourself. Quiet people are often the first to notice when something is wrong, and the last to be believed when they speak. So speak only when it serves you, or don't speak at all and move. That choice belongs to you. I didn't leave that situation with a dramatic ending. I left with something better: peace, clarity, and a deep trust in my own perception. I learned that being underestimated is not a curse. It's an opportunity, if you know how to use it with integrity. And maybe the most important lesson of all was this: you don't need to win to reclaim yourself. You just need to stop participating in what diminishes you. Before we end, I want to leave you with one question. One I hope you'll reflect on, and if you feel safe, share in the comments. Have you ever realized that the most powerful response to quiet disrespect wasn't confrontation, but choosing to quietly step away? Thank you for listening.